close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a building so sacred that the workers who built it were forbidden from making a single sound while assembling it. Imagine a structure so wealthy that its gold alone would be worth over $62 billion in today's money. Imagine a workforce of 183,000 human beings. No machines, no electricity, no computers, organized with such military precision that every single piece of stone, timber, and bronze arrived at the building site already finished, already perfect, already cut to its exact final dimension. Now imagine that this building was not constructed for a king, not for an emperor, not for a conqueror who wanted the world to remember his name. It was built for God, thousands of years before the first skyscraper pierced the sky, before the first crane lifted steel into the clouds, before modern engineering existed as a discipline, a small nation on a hilltop. In the ancient Near East did something the world had never seen and has arguably never repeated. They gathered the wealth of generations. They organized the labor of hundreds of thousands. They reached across borders, negotiated with foreign kings, sailed timber down the Mediterranean coast, and cast bronze in river valleys, all in service of a single consuming sacred vision. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a building. It is the story of what human beings are capable of when they believe deeply enough, prepare thoroughly enough, and are willing to give absolutely everything for a purpose greater than themselves. This is the story of the first temple of Jerusalem. The story of the first temple does not begin with construction crews or quarrymen. It begins with a vision, a divine architectural plan that was conceived and communicated long before a single stone was ever moved. According to biblical accounts, the design of the temple was not the product of human imagination or architectural ingenuity. It was revealed directly by God to King David, the father of the builder, who received the full structural layout, the measurements of every room, the specifications for every piece of furniture, the exact weight of gold and silver to be used in every instrument, and even the arrangement of the priestly divisions who would serve within its courts. David did not receive a vague spiritual impression. He received what the text describes as a precise written plan given by divine inspiration, covering every detail of what this sacred house would look like from foundation to rooftop. What makes this even more remarkable is that David himself was never permitted to build it. He was a man of war, and the responsibility of constructing this house of peace was passed to his son. But David did not waste those years of waiting. He spent his entire reign preparing, gathering gold, silver, bronze, iron, timber, and precious stones on a scale that no single generation had ever attempted. He pre-funded the most expensive construction project in human history before the first brick was ever laid. He assembled the materials, organized the workforce categories, established the priestly orders, and handed his son not just a blueprint on paper, but a ready-made foundation of resources and vision. This speaks to a profound truth about great undertakings, that the preparation phase, invisible and unglamorous as it is, often represents the majority of the real work. The builder received the credit, but the dreamer behind him had already done something extraordinary. The plan was heavenly in origin, and every detail that followed was a human effort to match the precision of a divine mind. To truly understand the scale of the temple's construction, you have to stop and absorb the numbers, because they are not the kind of figures you would associate with any ancient project. The total documented workforce stood at 183,300 people. This was not a loose gathering of laborers conscripted from nearby villages. This was a meticulously organized, professionally structured, multi-tiered labor force that functioned with the precision of a modern corporation. At the top sat 3,300 foremen and supervisors whose sole responsibility was managing the human flow of the project, directing who worked where, ensuring that materials arrived in sequence, resolving bottlenecks, and maintaining the extraordinary standard of quality that a sacred building demanded. Below them worked 70,000 men whose job was purely transportation, carrying the pre-cut stones, the timber beams, and the raw materials from the quarry sites and coastal ports to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And at the base of this operation worked 80,000 stonecutters stationed in the mountains, cutting and shaping every block of stone to its precise final dimensions before it left the quarry. Then there was the arrangement with Lebanon. 30,000 Israelite men were dispatched in monthly rotations, 10,000 at a time, to work in the forests of Lebanon alongside the Phoenician experts of King Hiram of Tyre. These men felled the famous cedars and cypress trees, which were then tied into great rafts and floated down the Mediterranean coast to the port of Joppa, where they were unloaded and carried overland to Jerusalem. The sheer logistical intelligence required to coordinate this across different countries, different terrains, different languages, and different skill sets, without any modern communication technology, is breathtaking. The project ran continuously for 7 years, which means this workforce was sustained, fed, managed, and coordinated every single day across that entire period. This was not just a construction site. It was a civilization organizing itself around a single sacred purpose, and doing so with a level of administrative sophistication that the ancient world rarely matched. Of all the extraordinary facts surrounding the temple's construction, perhaps none is more stunning to modern minds than the complete silence that accompanied the building process. The biblical account is explicit and specific on this point. During the entire 7-year period of active construction on the Temple Mount, not a single sound of a hammer, axe, chisel, or any iron tool was heard at the site. For a project of this size, involving hundreds of thousands of workers and the assembly of massive stone blocks, towering bronze pillars, and intricately carved cedar panels, this silence was not accidental. It was the result of an almost incomprehensibly sophisticated system of prefabrication that was executed entirely away from the building site. Every stone that would form the walls, floors, and foundations of the temple was cut in the mountain quarries to its precise final dimensions before it was transported. There was no trimming on site, no adjustments, no corrective chiseling. Each block arrived ready to be placed directly into its designated position. The cedar and cypress beams from Lebanon were cut, shaped, and finished in the forests before they were floated south. The bronze pillars, each standing 27 feet tall, were cast in clay molds in the Jordan Valley near the city of Succoth and transported complete to Jerusalem. The golden furnishings, the lampstands, the altar, the table of showbread, all were crafted in workshops by master artisans and delivered finished to their appointed places. What this means in practical terms is that the entire building site functioned like the final stage of an assembly line. Every component was manufactured elsewhere to perfect specifications, and the temple itself was essentially assembled rather than constructed in the traditional sense. This is not just a religious or symbolic detail. It represents a level of planning, measurement precision, quality control, and inter-site coordination that modern engineers genuinely admire. The tolerance for error was essentially zero because there was no opportunity to fix mistakes on site. Every measurement had to be right before the piece left its place of origin. The silence on the Temple Mount was not the silence of inactivity. It was the silence of perfection, the sound of a plan so thoroughly prepared that execution required nothing more than placing each piece exactly where it had always been destined to go. When scholars and economists have attempted to calculate the true cost of the first temple in modern monetary terms, the figures they arrive at are so large they strain credibility. And yet they are based directly on the quantities recorded in ancient texts that historians have no strong reason to doubt. The gold alone, the raw gold used in overlaying the walls, floors, ceiling, altar, and furnishings of the temple, has been conservatively estimated at a value exceeding $62 billion at early 21st century gold prices. That is not the total project cost. That is merely one material. When you begin to add the silver, which the biblical account records at over 1 million talents, a talent being approximately 75 pounds in weight, the figure multiplies into the hundreds of billions. Then you must account for the bronze used in the pillars, the sea, the lavers, and the various implements of the outer court. You must factor in the cedar and cypress timber imported from Lebanon at enormous political and financial cost. So great that 20 entire Galilean cities were handed over to King Hiram of Tyre as partial payment for the wood and the skilled labor his kingdom provided. You must consider the precious stones inlaid throughout the structure, the fine linen imported for the priestly garments and temple curtains, and the cost of feeding, housing, and compensating a workforce of over 183,000 people for 7 consecutive years. When economists have attempted to combine all of these figures into a single modern equivalent, estimates have ranged between 50 and several $100 billion, figures that dwarf the cost of the Burj Khalifa, the International Space Station, the Panama Canal, and virtually every other great construction project recorded in human history. What makes this even more staggering is the context. This wealth was generated and held by a relatively small nation occupying a narrow strip of land in the ancient Near East. The proportion of national wealth dedicated to this single structure was not a few percentage points of GDP. It represented, by some estimates, the concentration of multiple generations of accumulated national treasure poured into one building. No modern government, no matter how wealthy, has ever dedicated a comparable fraction of its national resources to a single sacred structure. One of the most underappreciated dimensions of the temple's construction is its international character. This was not a project built from local resources by local hands. It was, in the fullest sense available to the ancient world, a global enterprise, drawing materials, expertise, and labor from multiple nations across a wide geographic region, and doing so through carefully negotiated diplomatic agreements that reveal a sophisticated understanding of international trade and statecraft. The most significant of these partnerships was with Hiram, king of Tyre, the ruler of the Phoenician city-state that dominated the ancient Mediterranean world's timber trade and was home to the most accomplished craftsmen and sailors of the era. The agreement struck between the two kingdoms was detailed and formal. Lebanon would supply unlimited quantities of cedar and cypress timber. Phoenician craftsmen would provide their unmatched technical expertise, and in exchange, vast quantities of wheat, barley, olive oil, and wine would flow annually from Israel to Tyre, along with eventually 20 towns in the Galilee region. The master craftsman sent by Hiram to oversee the metalwork and bronze casting, a man of extraordinary skill whose mother was Israelite and whose father was a Tyrian bronze worker, became arguably the most important technical mind behind the project's most visible elements. He was responsible for casting the 2 massive bronze pillars at the temple entrance, the enormous bronze basin known as the Molten Sea resting on 12 cast bronze bulls, the 10 bronze lavers on wheeled stands, and hundreds of other bronze implements. The casting was done in the clay-rich soil of the Jordan Valley, far from the temple site, using techniques that Phoenician metalworkers had refined over generations. Meanwhile, gold arrived from Arabia, precious stones were gathered from across the known world, and the organizational knowledge required to manage all these supply chains simultaneously flowed from a royal administration that understood with remarkable clarity that building something truly extraordinary requires the willingness to reach beyond your own borders and draw on the best the world has to offer. At the geographical center of the temple, at the end of its innermost sanctuary, beyond the great veil woven of blue, purple, and crimson thread, lay a room that may be the most spiritually charged space ever constructed in human history. The Holy of Holies, known in Hebrew as the Devir, was a perfect cube, measuring 20 cubits in every direction, length, width, and height. It had no windows. It admitted no natural light. It was overlaid entirely in pure gold, walls, floor, ceiling, and every surface, so that in the rare moments when the high priest entered carrying a golden censer of burning incense, the thick smoke and the golden glow created an atmosphere that the ancient texts describe as the very dwelling place of divine presence. Inside this room rested the Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest containing the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, the jar of manna and Aaron's rod. Carried carefully into the temple, and placed beneath the outstretched wings of two massive golden cherubim, each standing 15 feet tall, their wings spanning the full width of the room from wall to wall. The access restrictions placed on this room were absolute and without exception. Not the king, not the generals, not the wealthy donors who had funded the building. None of them could enter. Only the high priest of Israel was granted entry, and even he could approach only once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day in the entire Jewish religious calendar. He entered alone after days of ritual purification, carrying blood for atonement and incense to fill the room with smoke, and he performed his sacred duties in the full understanding that any deviation from the prescribed ritual could cost him his life in the immediate presence of God. Ancient tradition records that a rope was sometimes tied to the high priest's ankle so that, if he died inside, his body could be retrieved without another person needing to enter. Whether literal or symbolic, this detail captures the extraordinary weight of reverence and holy fear that surrounded that room. The temple was magnificent in its entirety, but the Holy of Holies was its soul, the reason for every block of stone, every beam of cedar, every pound of gold that had been gathered across decades and assembled in sacred silence on a hill in Jerusalem.